here in Florida. As we all know, over the last decade, police brutality has exploded across America. Not that police brutality has not been an issue throughout the decades and the centuries, but because of the fact that we have smartphones now and cameras, more often than not, very rarely does a month go by that we do not have a new hashtag with a new American who has been killed based upon an unfortunate encounter with law enforcement. Some of the names that we say over the last 10 years have included Sandra Bland, where that appellation first began, but also Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Corinne Gaines, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling. More recently, just this year, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Rashard Brooks, Tony McDade. These are names that we all hear, we all see, and we are all outraged on a week-to-week basis because we recognize that more often than not, when these individuals who are unarmed wind up dead based upon an unfortunate encounter with law enforcement, those law enforcement officers are very rarely held to an account. So what we have this afternoon is Representative Lawson, a man who served in the Florida legislature for well over 3 decades and has been in Congress for the better part of this past decade, has convened a distinguished panel for you. Congressman Lawson, while he was in the Florida legislature, as well as in Congress, has been at the vanguard of pushing for social justice. I can remember back in 2007, when one of the other panelists you'll hear from tonight, Attorney Ben Crump and his partner Daryl Parks were pushing for justice for Martin Lee Anderson. It was Representative Lawson, actually Senator Lawson at the time in the state legislature, who was right at the forefront of making sure that justice was served for the Martin Lee Anderson family, and he has not stopped. So I'm looking forward to sharing this, the dais, so to speak, this virtual dais with him today. And as well, we have Attorney Benjamin Crump, an individual who you see on TV, in the newspaper, and on the internet all the time as he works indefatigably to make sure that the family members of those who have been killed based upon unfortunate encounters with reckless or murderous law enforcement officers are held to account. So with that, I will yield the microphone to Congressman Lawson, and then the next voice you will hear will be of Attorney Crump, and then I look forward to introducing and allowing the other distinguished panelists to be able to make their opening statements as well. Congressman Lawson.
Thank you very much, Attorney Hobbs. It's really is a great opportunity, and I'm happy to have all of you all joining us here tonight. Simply due to the fact is that America is faced with a tremendous challenge. And that challenge is, where do you go from here? As you know, W.E. Du Bois stated, and he said the biggest challenge that we will have in the 20th century will be racial injustice. And now we find out that we are still plagued with this in the 21st century. And so one of the main crises that affected our communities is going to be economic, social, and health. And that is a very dangerous combination that we see throughout America. I think what has really brought a lot of this to the forefront is the situation with George Floyd. And we've had the Black Lives Movement throughout this country. But not only has it been a movement here in America, but it's a movement nationwide, you know, and everyone has been getting involved. And I think one of the things when you go back and look back over the history in our careers, is we have seen a lot of things that happened. Like, you know, I grew up in a very segregated community. And many things that would happen with African Americans during that time, a lot of time it would be swept under the rug. No longer is that going to happen today. Those issues are going to come out. You know, when you see Attorney Crump, which I'll probably introduce to you in a few minutes, that is traveling America, all over America, you know, with all the injustice that we see that is happening. We have a panel here that is not only about criminal justice, but social justice, economic insecurity, you know, students, environment, you know, do they get a chance to get an education because they represent the future of tomorrow? We have seen this movement that incorporates not only but women that has been so important to any movement that we've had in America. You know, as you go back and look at the history, you will find that oftentimes women from the 60s on took a very active role And that role is to push and to give support and let people know that I'm not going to move back to the back of the bus, as Rosa Parks once said. You know, as I am going to stay here and continue to fight for justice in America because we have so much injustice. I can tell you, it was my privilege to co-sponsor the Justice and Policing Act. The legislation bans the use of chokeholds and no-knock warrants, which took the life of George Floyd, and then Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner. The bill also requires uniformed officers to wear body cameras and to use dashboard cameras. I know we have much to cover, and I'm not going to continue to talk about everything because this panel is just tremendous. A panel that we have, and there are going to be people listening all over the place. I would like now to bring on my good friend and introduce to you, I like to call him on a joking thing, the junior Cochran, you know, in America. But I'd like to bring to you a great friend, great attorney Ben Crump.
Thank you, Congressman Lawson. It definitely is a pleasure to be with you as my congressman fighting for us. As my good friend, Attorney Hobbs said, I see you have my colleague, Mark Schlackman and Professor Hodo. I look forward to hearing from all of you and these young people, because never ever forget what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the future of Grace and Xavier and Miss Jesula. These are the people who we are saying lives matter. We have to make sure that we stop these hashtags, Chuck. I mean, they're happening so fast, we can barely keep up with them. When I think about George Floyd and him begging Congressman Lawson, literally begging, not just for humanity, not just for respect, but he was begging for a breath, just to be able to sustain his life. And so when we argue in courtrooms, Chuck, all across America, what we're really arguing is that there are not two justice systems in America, one for Black America and another for white America. What we're fighting for is equal justice for every citizen in the United States of America. And so you think about the fact that Ahmaud Arbery, who I represent with a great team of lawyers, was jogging in Brunswick, Georgia. And he was lynched, literally, for jogging while Black. And Professor, not in 1940, not in 1950, this was in 2020, February 26, 2020. And you see, Congressman Lawson, it wasn't that the police saw the video of him being lynched in broad daylight that caused them to be arrested. It was when we, the people, saw the video that this murderous father and son duo of Travis McMichael and George McMichael was finally arrested. And then I think about our sister, Breonna Taylor, who I know I'll be with her family on Wednesday as we try to make sure people don't forget that Breonna Taylor life matters, because far too often sisters who are executed by police are not given the same attention and recognition as brothers who are executed by police. And so every interview, Congressman Lawson, I would do with Ahmaud Arbery, I would always say at the end of the video, and we can't forget our sister Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her own apartment, because Black women's lives matter too. And we kept saying that to the point where finally, they aren't sweeping her death under the rug, but they had every intention of doing so. And you don't have to take my word for it, Congressman Lawson. and we presented this at the United States House of Representatives. All you have to do, Mark, is look at the police report from Breonna Taylor. They literally had that there was no signs of forced entry, even though they had busted open her front door, and they said nobody was injured, even though Breonna was executed by the police that night. And so I guess in trying to make a few more points, because I really think everybody wants to hear what you all have to say, because you young people really inspire some ways that we can't even articulate. But the final couple of points I will make is never have I seen self-defense in black and white so vividly as I have seen it in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, in the case of Breonna Taylor. Remember, when Ahmaud Arbery was lynched in broad daylight and it was captured on video, the police saw the video on day one. And when they saw the video, the father and son, Travis McMichaels and Greg McMichaels, said self-defense. They said self-defense. And despite seeing that video, the police took their word for it and let them go home and sleep in peace for over 10 weeks. And it wasn't until the video was released, Mark, that finally, 74 days later, finally they arrested them. Now juxtapose that with what happened in Breonna Taylor's case in Louisville, Kentucky. Breonna, and boy, I'm a father of a daughter, Al, and I know you are. And so this really breaks your heart when you think about it, Professor. Imagine your child, your son, or in this case, your daughter, young adult, you've gotten them to adulthood, and they're not living with you anymore. She's in her apartment. She's working 2 jobs. She's trying to get her college degree as a nurse. And just imagine your child doing everything right in her bed sleep. Her boyfriend is over. They're asleep. It's the wee hours of the morning, between 12:30 and 1 a.m. And the Louisville Metropolitan Police, unbeknownst to them, never identifies themselves, never announces their presence, and they're in plain clothes. They take a battering ram. And the commission of executing a dangerous no-knock warrant, I believe, Mark, unconstitutional and unnecessary no-knock warrant. And they bust open her front door with that battering ram. Now, her boyfriend, Kenny Walker, who's 27 years old, no criminal history, never ever been arrested, working at the post office. Breonna Taylor, 26 years old, never been arrested, no criminal history, working 2 jobs as an EMT on the front line battling the coronavirus. In fact, Congressman Lawson, the thing her mother worried about most, that her daughter might contract the coronavirus and might get sick. Never imagining that the police were gonna kill her. And so Kenny Walker, this young black man, Chuck, who does what I think every strong brother would do, when they hear somebody who they think are trying to break into their apartment, thinking they are burglars, he gets his registered gun, he tips down the hallway, and as they come through the front door in plain clothes, he shoots a warning shot. And from that point, Congressman Lawson, the police just unload. They shoot 25 to 30 rounds from the front door of the apartment, from outside the side window, from the patio. I mean, they're shooting bullets from everywhere. It is so reckless what they're doing. They're blindly shooting from outside of an apartment into an apartment. And one of the bullets actually goes into the next door neighbor's apartment where a 5-year-old little boy is sleeping in the room, and it goes into his dresser drawer. And tragically, Breonna Taylor's body is mutilated with 8 bullets while she is practically naked in her underwear. And Kenny Walker, they absolutely, Congressman Lawson, believed that they were the subject of a home invasion. You don't have to take our word for it. Listen to the 911 tape. He calls, and if you think it's the police, you wouldn't call 911. But he calls and says, somebody broke into our apartment. They shot my girlfriend. Please help us. And it's heartbreaking. We don't have video on Brown, but you have that contemporaneous 911 tape where he is shaking Breonna, and that's what he tells us he was doing. And you hear him say, "Don't die, Breonna. Stay with me, baby. Don't close your eyes, Breonna. Stay with me." And it's just heartbreaking. Then Chuck, when the police confront him, he says, self-defense. We thought they were burglars. The police arrested him, took him to jail, and charged him with attempted murder, where he is facing life in prison if the police union get their way and those charges hold up. So you talk about self-defense when it's a white person saying self-defense versus when a black person says self-defense. It is vivid in living color in those two cases that happened within 2 weeks of each other, probably within 250 miles of one another. And that is America. And that's why we're having this panel discussion, because Black lives matter, our children's lives matter, and none of us can breathe until we get justice for George Floyd. And I thank you, Congressman Lawson, for being a leader on the George Floyd Justice in Police and Accountability Act, because if we don't use this moment to have systematic reform to change the culture and the behavior of policing in America, especially how it is when they interact with minorities, we would never be able to address the problem, which is, do America believe in the Declaration of Independence? We know you can quote the preamble, but do you really believe it when you say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Do you really believe that for George Floyd? Well, if you do, we want you to prove it to us. We want you to prove it to us for Breonna Taylor. We want you to prove it to us for Ahmaud Arbery, because I have no doubt if they came from different zip codes with different pigmentation in their skin, we would not have to fight so hard to get an arrest and charges made. So this is what we're fighting for. Thank you, Congressman Lawson. Thank you to this wonderful panel.
Thank you, Attorney Crump, as well as Congressman Lawson, for your opening statements. Now, I'd like to turn attention to our other distinguished panelists, and we are going to take each of you in alphabetical order. So I would like to start, I believe, with Ms. Grace Freedman. Hello, Grace.
Hello, I'm Grace Freedman. I'm a rising sophomore in college. I work with women's empowerment with Generation W and Generation WOW organizations here in Jacksonville. In high school, I worked with refugee youth in Jacksonville, Florida, with my organization named Jax Thrive. And in college, I helped lead the Justice Impact Movement, which is a student-led movement dedicated to making justice-impacted individuals a protected class in higher education.
Welcome, Grace, and thank you for that. Now we would like to turn our attention to Dr. Tammy Hodo. Good afternoon, Dr. Hodo.
Good afternoon, Chuck. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Tammy Hodo, and I'm the founder and president of All Things Diverse, which is an educational consulting company working with organizations to optimize employee productivity through recognizing the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I earned my Ph.D. at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in urban studies. I minor in sociology, and my specialization is in race, class, gender, and ethnicity. I worked in academia for over 15 years in a variety of positions to include administrator, diversity officer, as well as faculty in the sociology and criminal justice department. I provide training to local and national organizations all under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm a TEDx speaker where I spoke about the social implications of race. And I'm also a service-connected disabled veteran. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Now we have Ms. Jesula Jeannot. If you could please introduce yourself to our audience. Good afternoon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jesula Jeannot. Many people know me as JJ. I'm 21 years old. I am a student activist and advocate for the LGBTQIA+ community. I was born and raised in Haiti. And I'm very thankful to be in this panel to share my ideas and be a part of the conversation, because as young leader, we want to be a part of the change because we believe we are the change. So it's an honor for me to be here today.
Thank you so kindly. Next up, Mr. Xavier McClinton. Good afternoon, Mr. McClinton.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Xavier McClinton, a fourth-year economics student. I'm a student activist, as well as a couple of other things, and really esteemed and really happy to be on this panel this afternoon to talk about some of the issues that are facing many of us in this country this evening and these past couple of years. So looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And then last up, we have Professor Dr. Mark Schlackman. Good afternoon, sir. Professor Schlackman, there you go. Unmute your, there you go.
Someone had to be the first one to do that, so I relieved everyone else of that responsibility. My name is Mark Schlackman. I serve as Senior Program Director at Florida State University's Center for the Advancement of Human Rights. And over time, I've had the privilege of serving as counsel to Governor Lawton Chiles. I was a senior advisor to President Clinton, and then served in the George W. Bush administration, also having the privilege of working closely with Congressman Lawson on many issues involving social justice over the years, and a good friend and colleague, Ben Crump, who we, among other things, served together on the Innocence Project of Florida Board of Directors. So, Congressman, truly appreciate your invitation to join, and really look forward to hearing everyone and the students. Chuck, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And again, we want to thank everyone who has tuned in via Facebook Live, and I'd like to dive right in. One of the first questions I'd like to pose to the panel is, why is the Black Lives Matter movement important? And the way we can do this is each of you can speak on it, or only one or two. Whoever wants to hop in, hop in. Why is Black Lives Matter an important movement in 2020?
So I'd like to begin.
Sure.
Reality is that oftentimes when we say Black Lives Matter, I hear people say, well, all lives matter. Reality is all lives can't matter, and to the most vulnerable within our society, lives matter. And at this point, we know Black lives don't matter. We continue to see a variety of disparities when you think about mass incarceration, when you think about education, when you think about infant mortality rates. I don't know how many people know this, but African-American children in America, the death rate of infant mortality is comparable to third world nations. When we look at healthcare, if we look at COVID-19, the communities that are impacted are those minority communities. When we look at unemployment rates, we know Black lives don't matter, because while it may be 4 or 5% for the predominant group in America, if America catches a cold, the Black community has the flu, because ours is going to be double that amount. We just continue to see issues that show us that our lives don't matter. I don't know that Black lives have ever mattered in America. We seem to be a group that is very much an afterthought, disregarded. That's why you see the affinity groups that you do. And this needs to change. I am the mother of a 17-year-old African-American son, and I'm terrified. And I should not have to be concerned with my son having an encounter with anyone and being killed just for the beautiful complexion that he has. And my last thing to say is that reality is race isn't even biologically real. It's a social construct that is very much, something that has been reinforced in America in a way to segregate and stratify certain groups. And that's problematic in itself because race is not real biologically.
Indeed. Any of the other panelists, would you like to?
I'll say something really fast because unfortunately I apologize.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Attorney.
The injustices keep happening, so I got to deal with that 8-year-old kid who they arrested and put in handcuffs, if you can imagine that. Maybe call you on that one, Mark. But Chuck, the reason I think it's important what the professor said to highlight in just very dramatic terms, Congressman, when you think about the fact that the police killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice playing on the playground by himself in Cleveland, Ohio. They killed Laquan McDonald, 17 years old, running away from the police in Chicago. 14 officers on the scene. They thought it was appropriate that this officer should be able to shoot him 17 times while he's running away. Mike Brown, everybody in the Canfield community said he had his hands up when the police officer shot him in broad daylight. Terrence Crutcher, Tulsa, Oklahoma, walking away in broad daylight on video with his hands up when the white policewoman shot him. Botham Jean in Dallas, Texas, CPA doing everything right. I mean, kind of like these smart, sharp young people on his couch in his living room eating ice cream. White policewoman allegedly comes into the wrong apartment, shoot and kill him because he moved a certain way. Stephon Clark had a cell phone, shot him in his grandmother's backyard. And when you juxtapose that with how America, not just police, but America, look at little white children and white young people, it's just, you have to say Black Lives Matter to try to indoctrinate it into their minds because it is not apparently in their subconscious. When you think about what happened with Parkland, Florida, little white boy went and shot 34 people, killing 17 of them. The police followed him for hours and they took him alive. The Waffle House killer in Tennessee shot and killed 4 people in the Waffle House. The police chased them into the woods. Chuck, they all came out alive. Can you imagine if that was a Black person who had killed some people, the police chased them into the woods with a gun, and they all come out alive? And worst of all, Dylan Roof, this young white supremacist, goes into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and kills 9 of the most innocent people you could ever find. And what does he say during the interview with the police? He said, I felt bad about killing them because they were so nice to me. Congressman Lawson, the police chased him not only for hours, but they chased him across state lines from South Carolina into North Carolina. And then when they captured him, they took him to Burger King to get a burger and fries while they took him to jail. But yet they take all these young white men alive. But if a Black person moves a certain way, they shoot and kill them. And so what that tells you first and foremost, Congressman Lawson, is that they disregard the fact that race is a fallacy and they put importance on it. And they obviously have criminalized the color of our skin to the point where not only do they think they can kill us by putting these trumped up charges on us in courtrooms, but they feel it's justifiable to kill us in the streets physically. And that's the only way you can explain why they don't shoot these young white boys, but all those young black people who we name, they shoot first and ask questions later. And that's why Black Lives Matter in 2020, because we have to speak truth to power every time we get a chance, because we can't let them think that, oh, just because they say it's legal, that makes it right. As Dr. King said, just because it's legal, don't make it right. Everything that Hitler did to the Jews in Germany was legal. That didn't make it right. Slavery was legal. Chuck, that didn't make it right. Segregation was legal. That didn't make it right. Legality cannot be our standard for morality. And so Black Lives Matter has to be the argument we make, and it's not based on any legislation or anything, but we do have to change these protests into policy. And that's when Congressman Al Lawson and others come into play, because young people, you all are doing your jobs. Now we got to make sure the United States Congress and the White House do their job so we don't lose this moment. And I thank you, Congressman Lawson, for the opportunity.
You're welcome.
Thank you. JJ, I see you trying to get in. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to add, I feel like for me as a young leader in my community, I feel like the reason why Black Lives Matter movement is very important is because we see so many things that is so familiar. It's so similar to every day you wake up. It can be my brother, it can be me. So it becomes too personal. It becomes too personal. And when it gets like this, it's, wow, enough is enough. I feel like the movement, it's a movement of, we are tired. I am tired of living of fear. Like, I don't want to go outside too late. I'm scared. My mother is in Haiti. She's afraid that me using my voice might cost me my life. She's afraid of certain things. So I feel like this movement is a humanity cry for help. Black Lives Matter movement, it's a humanity cry out for help. And that's why we need conversation like this. We need allies, we need leaders like this. Not only we are tired of protesting, we are tired of being in the streets, but we have to say enough is enough. That's why we're walking, that's why we're marching, that's why we're showing our face, not because we want to, it's because we want to be heard. We want people to see us. And this movement, I see it as a revolution. It's a wake-up call from the youth that say, I can't do it no more, and I'm going to be in your face by any means necessary, because you have to hear me, because it can be my brothers, it can be my friends, and we can't do it anymore. So this movement is very, very important, and I'm glad to see that we taking it as serious as it needs to be. And I'm glad that we're having conversation like this to empowering the youth not to be afraid to stand up, because they are a part of the change, and we can't stay quiet, we can't stay silent. And moment like this is what make it more worth it to say, you know what, maybe there is a hope, maybe there is a chance, because I feel like I'm being heard. I feel like all the things that I'm working for, somebody's listening. I think that's what the youth is asking, is somebody is listening. And when you listen, that's when change started to happen.
JJ makes an interesting point. And one thing that I want to point out before we go to the next question is that many of us who have studied the civil rights movement, and for some of our panelists who had the benefit of being alive and or participating during that era, when you look back 40, 50, 60 some odd years ago, many of the protesters, if not the majority of the protesters, were Black. Of course, there were some white allies. There were a number of Jewish allies who participated in the movement from the founding of the NAACP on through the core, SCLC, and name it. But for the most part, the movement for civil rights through the 1950s and 1960s was a primarily Black-inspired and Black body-filled movement. Now, ever since George Floyd was murdered right before our eyes back in May of this year, one of the things that has surprised me, even as a 48-year-old male, is seeing the number of Americans, and not just Americans, but people across the world, diverse protests, whites, Blacks, Asians, Latinos. It has completely amazed me. And I would like to talk to the panelists a little bit about, why do you think that is? What was the catalyst, so to speak, that the George Floyd murder in particular has now created a multiracial, multicultural movement for change? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Chuck, I think it's critically important that we It's absolutely unacceptable to diminish the singular importance of this moment. And as I've heard Congressman Lawson say, take steps to ensure that this is a movement and not merely a moment, but a hugely important moment. But that focus, that singular focus, does not mean, and it loops back to your question, that there aren't others that have maybe not similar, but concerns about whether, to what extent there are universal human rights that apply to everyone. Dr. Hodo, in deference to you, whether actual or perceived race, whether color, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, familial status, nationality, national origin, religion, belief, non-belief, age, disability, culture, experience, thought. Communities are coming together. And I think the challenge now is the voices, the energy, again, cannot allow the moment to be diminished, and the singular focus defines itself. But I think what this does is it opens up the optics to revisit, well, actually, what is the cause of universality of human rights? That means those human rights apply to everyone, regardless of where they live, who they are, what they look like, what their socioeconomic status is. And there may be ways to look back to move forward in terms of trying to capture some ways to operationalize this cause, this singular cause that we're convening tonight to discuss. But also, it doesn't mean that there aren't other causes that are important that can't be advanced at the same time. And it goes right to the nature of your question, in cooperation together with others of very different backgrounds.
Thank you. Xavier, looks like you wanted to weigh in. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that this device right here has a large part to do with it. I think over the past couple of years, what makes this movement so much different than the civil rights movement, which was super effective, is the fact that people can see it on a day-to-day basis, the interaction. The civil rights era, you may be able to see some things on camera and hear about certain things, but the fact that you can see a video, the interaction itself, and I still believe that there's humanity in Americans and humanity in this world. And so when you see a video of something tragic happening, and you start to put yourself or your kids or your family members or your mother in that situation, you realize that you just can't stand for anything and you can't continue to be silent. So you see a lot of people, especially younger folks, decide that, look, even though this doesn't directly affect me, this affects somebody that I know, or this affects somebody that could potentially happen to them. And you start to see everybody come together and bridge this gap and really start to amplify their voices together.
That's an interesting point. One of the things that I noticed, judging from the anecdotal evidence that is my Facebook and social media feeds, is the fact that even a number of people who are typically the ones who will cry Blue Lives Matter whenever a Black Lives Matter slogan is chanted, or support the blue and things of that nature, even a number of those cynics, if I may, were disturbed by George Floyd, at least initially. A number of my conservative friends, they would not necessarily come on a post to make a comment, but they would inbox me or text message me saying how disgusting that was. And when I would engage back and tell them that, yes, George Floyd's murder was disgusting, but there are hundreds more across the country, like you pointed out, Xavier, that are not filmed, that a lot of victims are not getting the same benefit of the doubt because they tend to not believe victims who are saying that these encounters with law enforcement are bad. Grace, what are some of your thoughts with regards to your generation coalescing in a way that prior generations simply have not when it comes to pushing forward this social justice movement?
Yes, I think social media is a really important tool when it comes to gathering groups of people. But I also think it's important to note that social media, because it is so easy to post, it is so easy to tweet, that is where our work should start and not where it should end. And I also think it's important to note that while it's incredibly important that we have a very diverse set of allies coming to support the Black Lives Matter movement, that people, especially white people, know their role within the movement, meaning it is that of support, it is that of uplifting Black voices, it is that of passing the mic, it is that of using their platform and position of privilege to help others who are more marginalized. And it's incredibly important to be active allies and advocates, but to also know what is their time and what is not their time, and to speak on behalf of certain issues, and when it is the proper time to pass the mic and to elevate other individuals.
Very good. One of the other things that I wanted to point out is, and I got a comment here when I'm looking at the feed from the audience with regards to the militarization of the police. And I can tell you that, again, having been a former prosecutor and defense attorney and having handled dozens of cases over the last 20 some odd years, the police have become far more militarized, even within my career, than in my lifetime, than they ever were before. And I'm quite sure Congressman Lawson would weigh in and say the same thing. You go to the sheriff's office or the police department and you see tanks, you see all sorts of automatic weapons. And while one could definitely make the argument that some of that material is necessary, particularly in larger cities where potentially the gangs and or the drug war, so to speak, could put law enforcement at a disadvantage, I have sometimes been troubled in smaller cities where gang warfare is not that prominent, that law enforcement still spend quite a bit of their budget on the latest high-tech weaponry that would make most of the Joint Chiefs of Staff with regards to the military proud of what it is that they have. With regards to that, I'd like to throw out to the panel, what are your thoughts with regards to the hyper-militarization of law enforcement and what effect that has on the angst that we see between the blue and unarmed citizens of all races, but again, most prominently among people of color? Anybody want to hop in?
I think I would start off, and I was listening with great thoughts about when everyone was actually speaking. I want to say this because I think it's important to bring this out first. Among my colleagues in Congress, when the Black Lives Movement started, many of them on the other side of the aisle wanted to get their own definition of what Black Lives Matter really mean. They were not really asking what Black Lives Matter really meant. They were trying to figure out where they saw so much diversity in the Black Lives Movement. And so as a result is they thought it would be something that you could just sweep under the table and say, well, because of George Floyd, you know, sweep it under the table. But what has happened, and that's the reason why I always like to get involved with young people. The young people represent the leadership of tomorrow. And many of the young people came up in a different type situation in schooling and everything than I came up in, which was segregated schools until I got it in college. And so as a result, they have interacted with each other from kindergarten all the way up through high school. They get to know each other better. They get to have different kind of feelings than people maybe that came up in my era. Unless you're someone like Mark Schlackman, who has traveled all over the world in terms of with human rights issues and things that affect people and how you go about changing communities and so forth and determine what is right and what people should have. Either like Dr. Hodo, who actually specializes in some of those areas. A lot of times people don't really understand. And what I'm saying, I wanted to, as Mark said, to be more than a moment, but as a movement throughout America. This is a time when we have the opportunity to change the course of where America is going. When it related to economics, and you look at poverty, what has happened. What I've learned in Congress in the 3.5 years I've been there, that we have the capacity and the resources to really wipe out poverty in America. You know, and I say really wrap up popular America, just like the homeless population, we have the resources to do it. As you can see in the CARES bill, when we passed out $2.5 trillion, you see when we bail out Wall Street in 2007 and 9, and all of the big financial institutions doing well because I serve on the financial committee, and they come in there and say, well, our resources are just tremendous. We're doing just great. And so as a result, this is a time when we made it mandatory that you bail out America with this pandemic, something that we have never seen before. And so we sent a HEROES bill down to the Senate with $3 trillion in it, because people still need resources. They're out of work. You know, the kids got to go back to school. We did not even put the amount of money that is necessary to make for schools, like maybe $490 per individual, to make sure that kids can go back to school safe. And so as a result, times are changing. And really, it's been because of the young people, because what made the Florida legislature change and people came was Parkland, when those kids came all the way to Washington, D.C. and said, we want you to march with us. You know, we won't change. So the young people right now want to change would be best for America. But you got to understand, there's a lot of people out there who really don't like this change. You know, I had a very conservative person who is a Republican asked me, he said, can you explain to me why my daughter came home and was making up signs about Black Lives Matter and going over to Tallahassee to march with a group of students? You know, that's not the way we brought it up. And I said, well, change is coming. And what you're facing is change. And young people want to see a better America. They want to see that people get along. They want to stop all the killing. And one of the things that you need to know, the reason why I was a co-sponsor of the bill, because there's no standards in our police and sheriff's office, and there need to be standards that are kept in the training that they require of continuing education is really not very good. You know, so when you talk about defunding the police, what you're saying is when a lot of the dollars that you're getting to do social work, you know, to get Miss Jones' cat out of the tree, to potholes in the street, that money needs to be going into areas where you can have better response for social work, for psychological problems, for people who need therapy and so forth. And so that's what you mean. But in terms of these military weapons and stuff that you see that we're sending down to different agents in the police, it shouldn't be done. There's no way that we should be fighting against each other with those kind of weapons. So I just wanted to say that and let everyone else go ahead and comment on it.
Thank you, Congressman Lawson, for that response. And you touched upon a very critical portion, which is that segues perfectly in the question, which is we're talking about the hyper militarization of law enforcement, but also the training piece that you address. And I think that, again, that's been one of my biggest concerns over the course of the last 15, 20 years, is that more often than not, these unarmed citizens, black, white, or whatever race, that wind up killed or beaten are not drug dealers. They're not heavily armed gangbangers. They are citizens who may have had an improper lane change on their way home from work, or may have been speeding, or even if it was a misdemeanor, like selling loose cigarettes or a counterfeit bill, those individuals are some type of Bonnie and Clyde or Al Capone type enforcement officers who are just blazing away. So I see Xavier, I see Dr. Hodo. Xavier, hold the point. I'm an old school Southern gentleman. Ladies first. Dr. Hodo, go ahead and take the microphone.
Thank you. So I have a few things to add. With the militarization piece, that's very problematic, and I seem to only see the tanks and things used in certain communities, and that's a problem. And I appreciate what Grace said. Is the reality is that we do have allies, but they have to know their role within the movement. You know, but we do need our allies, because we've never been able to really accomplish much on our own, because oftentimes we're viewed as different, inferior, and all these ridiculous kind of antiquated ideologies about African Americans. I think of the George Floyd case, I think to me what brought that about in regards to all the people kind of coming together is it was the perfect storm. We have COVID-19, we're locked in place, and people saw that video. And if you have a heart, there's just no way that you could have not noticed, you know, the issue with that. You know, this man was screaming out, asking for his mother who was deceased, you know, asking just to have a breath. And studies continuously show that African-American males, our children particularly, at age 11, they're perceived to be adults. You know, we've seen the criminalization of Black and brown bodies in America. When I look at mass incarceration and know that over 2 million people are incarcerated and 1 million of them are Black and brown men, and more than half are there for nonviolent drug offenses, but we just legalized medicinal marijuana. That's very problematic to me. And it shows you the disparities that we have. And all these things, I mean, no one can live a righteous life until everybody has equity. And there's a difference between equality and equity. And we don't have equity because we're starting from a whole different frame of reference. I mean, we've basically had, you know, somebody's boot on our neck for the last 200, you know, or 400 years. And we're behind everyone else. You know, when the congressman spoke about bailing out Wall Street, I think about the big housing bust of 2008 and how the disparity, when I looked at it based on race, I see that, you know, minorities continue to get loaned subpar loans compared to their counterparts, even if they have the same credit score. I mean, these things are institutional, it's systemic, and it's intentional. And it has to be, we have to do away with this and develop new mechanisms, because when all these things were brought about, African Americans weren't even considered a person. You know, so I think these are just a lot I have just a lot going on in my mind about what the issues are and how to address them. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Dr. Hodo. Xavier, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Dr. Hodo hit on so many points right there. But I think that as far as the militarization of the police, it's unwarranted. You see this militarization and these high grade military weapons being used in one specific community. And I think, like she mentioned, it doesn't go towards the drug dealers. It doesn't go towards these violent criminals. It goes towards protests and peaceful protests that are being shown up. I watched a video today of a young man, I think it was somewhere in California, Southern California. That he was being attacked by a homeless man, and three police officers showed up and immediately pulled out weaponry on these young individuals. I think they were 14, 15 years old, and they were the ones being attacked. And the police officers hopped out with assault rifles pointing at the kids. And that's not what you need in that situation. You need somebody who's going to come in and actually police the situation, figure out what's going on, make an accurate assessment before you start to threaten other people's lives and feel that your life is threatened. And so I think that whenever you think about the role of the police officers and that they're supposed to protect the community, keep everybody safe, when you bring in these high artillery weaponry, it doesn't keep the community safe. It really just puts everybody at a deeper advantage, or disadvantage rather, and makes everybody unsafe and feel really anxious about just being in a particular space. You can see what's going on in Portland, and bringing in this heavy artillery doesn't fix the situation at all. All it does is spur things on and make it continue in a spiral effect, and doesn't make it any worse. Instead of actually listening to what people are saying and what the problems that they want to talk about and what they want to see changed, you bring in these high artillery weaponry and these federal agents, and now you see a bigger situation, a bigger problem than what it originally was. If you would just stop for 10 minutes and just listen to what we're asking for.
Mark, let me ask you, what are your thoughts when you hear individuals sometimes that are from a law enforcement background, or even individuals who like to call themselves law enforcement supporters, and which always gives me pause, because I don't know many Americans who do not support law enforcement. I believe that what we support are good law enforcement officers who are out doing their jobs, and we want to see the ones who are not doing the jobs in the appropriate ways be held accountable. But with that in mind, from the training piece that Congressman Lawson talked about, as well as Dr. Hodo, as well as Xavier, how can we bridge the gap with that solid number of our fellow Americans who seem to have a disconnect with regards to how law enforcement interact, particularly in communities of color. What are some ways that we can address that divide?
Chuck, thank you. And just a couple of quick observations. One, I think this is the unstated observation. There are a range of different approaches taken by various law enforcement officials at senior levels, whether it's sheriffs or police chiefs. Some are dramatically different. For instance, in the Leon County, I happened to I listened to Sheriff McNeil say one day, we cannot afford to continue to fund systems and condone practices that are oppressive and abusive, systems where the solution routinely involves use of force. So on the specific issue of training, I'm just sharing a personal reaction with you. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Training wasn't involved in that decision. How do we need to be trained not to employ a chokehold for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? That training it clearly has a role and a place and a priority. In my humble personal opinion, that was not about training. But to wind out on your question, because I know you want to cover a lot of ground, moving beyond that scenario, training is critically important, and so is cultural sensitivity and addressing the terms that were in vogue and now may be slipping out, implicit bias that people are not necessarily even aware that they have until they react. So all of that is critically important. And I think now I'm just extrapolating from comments that have been made largely by our student activists tonight and Dr. Hodo. We have to find it, saying it a different way, we have to find a means to operationalize this cause and to make it, again, to repeat specifically, to make it, to recognize the moment, but to make it more than a moment. And I think the frameworks are there. And as an aside, not to interject humor in such a serious matter, but Congressman Lawson has told me he expects a list of options on his desk very soon as to what he can do to try to help move this forward. Because it involves, and your question, and I'll pause there, I mean, it also involves basic concepts of governance. How can the federal level coordinate, cooperate at the state level, at the local level? Tallahassee, we have some, it appears that people with some, integrity in different positions. We have 2 different law enforcement agencies. So there are a lot of complications, but I think the strength of what was already identified, the singular importance of this moment and the allies. I mean, there are frameworks that we can use to try to advance this cause. And I know even though Congressman Lawson isn't involved in the local and state issues now, he's following them, tracking them very, very closely.
Thank you, Mark. JJ, I see that you've...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so to piggyback off what you said, I realized that too, training is a small piece of what's happening. When you look at it, it's very much when a police officer stops someone, there is already an intention. Like you said, the amount of time it doesn't take training for somebody to have common sense to realize what they are doing. My opinion is the fact that many people from law enforcement, they know they will get away with things. They have not been held accountable for their actions. So I feel like the main issue is the people from higher up to come up with a solution. If they know there are consequences, now they will perhaps act better. And it's a cultural difference too. I know many of my friends, the way we brought up, the way we talk, sometimes we're not yelling, but they think we're being defensive. They think that we act in a certain way. They think that we're angry, but when in reality, that's our normal tone. So there's like, who are watching us? Who are there to protect us? Is it people who understand us? So I feel like it's the process of picking who's supposed to watch what neighborhood, who's supposed to do what with what neighborhood. If you cannot empathize, you cannot connect with me, there's no way you can protect me. I feel like the conversation is way bigger. And when we talk about having those weapons and scare people, you're not there to scare people away. How kids are afraid to go outside to play because if they say police officers, they're gonna hide behind a car. They don't want to be seen because they don't want to get killed. So it's the relation that we're creating with that community, finding that transparency between citizen and law enforcement and people higher up. One thing too, I would love to make a good point is when things like that happen, somebody says something, the transparency between higher up supposed to be very open. Like when we outside protesting, we ask to see for the tapes, we ask to release the names of the people who do certain things, make sure that you're hearing us. So the police, the bad actor know that they cannot get rid of it. And even people and the police officers who think they're good, but if you're not speaking, you're no longer good because you there, you support what's happening. So it's each one of us holding ourselves accountable. It has nothing to do with training. It's holding ourselves accountable. If you're a law enforcement person, you see your partner did something that wasn't right, don't just call it and say, oh, next time don't do that. Make sure your voice is being heard. It's about holding ourselves accountable and understand who's watching who. Sometimes if you don't understand me, I'm speaking, you may think I'm being defensive, but in reality I'm not. And you may react a certain way. I didn't mean to, you didn't mean to, but I lost my life for what? So it's understanding who's watching who, who's protecting who, and what can we do as a society and as a community to create that transparency, to create that comfortable for me to be honest, for me to be open, for me to know that you're there for me. So in order to see those changes that we want to see.
Thank you, JJ. Grace, I want to ask you this next question, and it segues from the prior ones. With regards to your generation, we're blessed to have 3 panelists this evening. All of you are young Americans committed to positive change. Grace, what are your thoughts with the movement as it currently is comprised, particularly since the death of George Floyd? Do you see among individuals, your friends in your age group, that this will be a sustained movement, both from a public policy advocacy standpoint, as well as a voting standpoint heading into November, or even the primaries here in Florida in the next couple of weeks, but into the November elections? Are you seeing that this is something that will continue to galvanize your generation?
Yes, I think I've seen masses of youth being mobilized from like the Black Lives Matter movement and these protests, and that more than ever, voting is important and that everyone is posting about it, everyone is talking about it. And I'm incredibly optimistic about my generation's role in voting, and that we are not apathetic, and that we care very deeply about these issues, and that we will take our passions to the voting booth when it comes down to the presidential election. And something that I would just like to add that relates to kind of policy and how the movement will transform into actionable policy is that when we talk about the militarization of police, it also relates to the hyper-masculine environment that policing is and the aggressive environment that policing is. And it really comes down to the question of whether punitive justice works, whether violence and force and aggression is the answer to address these issues, and what would happen if by using our right to vote, we directed money that goes to funding the militarization of police and invested that in education in certain communities. If we talked about drug use as a public health issue, if we started investing in juvenile after-school programs, if we invest in public housing. And so I really think that my generation is incredibly vocal about investing in areas such as education, public housing, public health. And I'm incredibly optimistic about the outcomes of what will come out of this. And yeah, I mean, we're not going to be silent until real actionable steps are made.
Grace, that's an excellent point. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you spoke is the Rayshard Brooks killing up in Atlanta back in June. The escalation there was amazing. I think many of us saw it. I'm quite sure everybody on the panel saw the loops of the videos where obviously law enforcement had reason to believe that young Mr. Brooks may have been inebriated. But when you looked at that video, even though they were going through the steps that law enforcement take to determine the level of sobriety of an individual, Mr. Brooks was very cooperative. He was not speaking in an agitated type of tone, as JJ was speaking about earlier, cooperative. And at some point in time, it went from a calm interaction there with law enforcement to next thing you know, they're grabbing him by the arms. He's squirming and trying to get out. And within seconds, he's shot and he's dying in that Wendy's parking lot. And so when we're talking about reforming the police, is it your opinion, and then I'd also like for Xavier and JJ to weigh in if they would, that even from the training standpoint that Congressman Lawson spoke about and that Mark spoke about, not just training, but also the humanity to understand that individuals at times, and let me just go ahead and put this out here. I have seen a number of times in my career where the level of agitation with law enforcement is more heightened depending on the color and or the gender of the individual who they are interacting with. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen instances where young students who are not Black or Latino have cursed out law enforcement, fought with law enforcement, spat at law enforcement, and lived to tell. And we see that nationally. And yet a Black person can even grunt wrong, and next thing you know, they're shot and heading to the morgue. Do you think that training or is it a personnel standpoint? Do you think that law enforcement is attracting the wrong type of hyper-aggressive males, so to speak, and or women who are trying to fit into that hyper-aggressive male hierarchy? And I know I just said a lot, but I guess I'm basically boiling it down to, is it possible at all to get law enforcement to dial back on their own, or do you think it will take legislation and or stronger local level public policy to make those changes so that, again, an improper lane change doesn't end with a trip to the morgue?
Right. I definitely support reforms when they're made, but I think that there is a certain extent in which reforms can impact a historically very racist occupation. And I believe that then that comes down to holding our government accountable and saying whether we can redirect the funds, whether we can take an active role, and defunding, when we talk about defunding the police, and whether we can take that funding and we can dedicate that to other things in the communities that could probably be way more beneficial, such as education and such as drug use and using that as a public health issue. And when it comes to addressing poverty, when it comes to addressing economic inequalities in public housing. And so I do think ultimately it boils down to whether the government is going to intervene and actively redirect some of those funds that come from the policing organizations and redirect them into more beneficial things for the community.
Anyone else want to talk about that? Xavier, I see you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just to back up for a second, I'm originally from Brunswick, Georgia. So the Ahmaud Arbery case was one that really hit home for me. I think that for me, that was one that really, I mean, when you see something happen in your backyard and to somebody that you've seen and that you had close friends with that knew somebody growing up, that's something that you ponder on for a long time, and you think about how that could have been you growing up. But I think going back to the part about training, my dad had the opportunity to sit on the Clinton County Police Department's review committee after the incident. And so we've had plenty of conversations about what's next, how do you improve from this, how do you go from here? And one of the big things that he always talked about was the culture of the police departments, and how a lot of times it's parents who start off in the police department, they bring their sons on, and then their sons come on, and their uncles or their grandparents or their nieces and nephews come to the police department, and they're teaching the same kind of indoctrined principles or interaction philosophies with people. And so you think about how segregation may have taken place in the past, right? And so you have a father who was policing in the community during segregation, Jim Crow laws. And so the way that he interacts with somebody, he was taught how to interact with somebody during those time periods. He's going to pass the same philosophy down to his kids and his grandkids and his nephews and nieces who come into the police force after that. And so I think that it just regurgitates and reiterates the fact that there needs to be a whole culture change in the police department itself, and that you can only go so far, like Grace said, with reform as far as policy and with reform as far as training is concerned. It all takes it takes a whole holistic kind of interaction with diversity, with understanding of inclusion, and understanding the community that you're policing, and understanding how you interact with people and how that's perceived from one culture to the next culture, and just understand it's a humanity thing, and you can't just take a singlistic or one-sided approach to it. It's going to take levels and to different levels to the approach to really fix the situation.
Thank you, Xavier. JJ?
Yes, I agree. I agree with Xavier because I really believe that it's a humanity thing and it's a cultural thing that needs to be happen. The process of hiring a police officer is so easy, and like the way that they're dealing with it, their job is very hard. It's creating that space before training who you're hiring first. Like before you training, you need to know what type of background this person have, what type of person. All of this cultural aspect is very important, and it comes together at the end. So it's about changing the culture, understanding who you're hiring and what that person, because a lot of police officers had a lot of internal things that they need to work on. You don't know. Training can change so much. So I really believe it's the background checks, the going do so much more than just hiring and trying to train somebody. You cannot train somebody internal opinion. You cannot change somebody racist ways. That's something training cannot change, but we need to, like Xavier said, have some sort of breaking through different culture, trying to not, like you said, if you have somebody with somebody, they're gonna continue keeping that same culture. So creating a new culture so it doesn't repeat itself. We don't want what's happening to be something whenever we hear the next Black life that's taken away, we walk. We don't want this. That's why this movement is very important, because we are tired. We're tired of seeing the same story. Just at this point, I have like a sign. I just say their name where I leave the hashtag blank, because we don't know who's gonna be next. And that shouldn't be something a 21-year-old person have to worry about, who's next. It shouldn't have to. And we shouldn't have to be dealing with this, with certain situation that is happening in our community, and it's happening right here in our community. So changing that culture is very, very important, in understanding the next generation cannot take it. So this one right here, we need to work in coalition with each other. The older generation, people in office and student leaders needs to come up and keep that movement alive to make sure this doesn't continue to happen anymore.
Mark and then Dr. Hodo. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd actually like to just briefly comment in just very summary fashion with all three comments that were just made. Because it absolutely is a corporate cultural issue within law enforcement community, just as it is a real world cultural issue to better understand who we are, who we're not, to disabuse the myths. There's opportunity and challenge in that, because there are different approaches taken by whether it's a police department or a sheriff's office. And I think to promote the most effective advocacy and to promote accountability, it's both the opportunity and almost a responsibility of the advocate to discern where those corporate cultures are. In other words, to better understand within ABC law enforcement entity, is that the same as DEF, and should the approaches be different? Because again, I think implied within your comments, and you're all right on point from my perspective, it's just now, how do we calibrate that? Because there are some people there, leaders in law enforcement, that get it, to oversimplify. And there are some, staying with simplification, that don't. So how do we identify? And then just very quickly, I know we're bumping into time. Grace, your comment about voting has many different dimensions. So just to state one aspect of this, Florida's notorious history for felony disenfranchisement long after a sentence has been completed for all intents and purposes. That's an ongoing battle, as you know, subject to federal litigation now. There's another aspect, though, in terms of encouraging people to vote. And I know you're not just talking about the criminal justice system, but this is part of it. In county detention facilities, in Florida alone, there are 45,000 people, and as of July 20, 928 in Leon County. People in local detention facilities, county detention facilities, by and large, have not lost their civil rights. There are always exceptions. But these are people who are pre-trial, awaiting trial, at sometimes called a jail, or they're serving out a misdemeanor sentence. So it's an access to voting issue. 45,000 people in Florida alone, nearly 750,000 people in the United States. So there are so many aspects of how to operationalize an effort, a strategy that moves these issues forward. You're all speaking to some hugely important issues. Dr. Hodo, I defer to you.
Thank you. I have a couple things to say. So JJ, I know what you were saying, and I love the quote by Fannie Lou Hamer when she says, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." And that's what I think our youth are. And I'm sick and tired. I'm not a youth, but I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired too. When it comes to policing, I think the reality is that we live in a hyper-segregated society that is based on social economic status, which has a direct relationship to race and ethnicity. And too often we see police officers who are not familiar with the people that they're policing, and they don't understand the differences. So again, to what JJ said, then all of a sudden you're an angry Black woman. That's another label that's been placed on the Black and brown bodies, right? Particularly females, and the hypersexualization of the Black and brown body. The males, the hypercriminalization of them is just amazing. But I think with the hypersegregation, that's a major issue because we have police who have never interacted with people who look like me. And they come in and they can make assumptions through the units of socialization, right? And implicit bias, we all have that. And the units of socialization are the media, the school, our peers, and things of that nature, and they kind of reinforce that. I mean, if I looked at the media and that's all I knew about the Black and brown communities in America, I would be afraid too. You know, the way that they're often depicted. As Mark said, I worked on Amendment 4 to restore the voting rights of the convicted felons in Florida. I mean, because that they are disenfranchised. They're not afforded that opportunity to vote. I mean, there are exceptions. Anyone who's done a murder or a sexually violent type crime obviously won't get that right back. And my last point is I think about right now, so census 2020, right? We know how many Black and brown bodies we just spoke about are incarcerated. They're incarcerated typically in rural areas. And guess what? When the census is taken, that's where they're counted, even though that's not where they live. At that moment they live there, but that's not the community that they're going to return to. So we're going to see funds and legislation and you know, make it appear that there's a larger demographic or a larger population in these rural areas, which oftentimes lack diversity, you know, but they're going to get more funding and more opportunities because it appears that they have more representation. So all these things need to be looked at. But again, this is all systemic. And it's not by accident, and we have to be very intentional when we redevelop a correct system that is equitable to all. I think too many people are afraid that they're going to lose their privilege if other people gain equity. And there's enough pie for everybody. It's not like cake or pie, everybody's gonna get a slice. So that's not at all the case.
30 seconds to weigh in. Human rights is not a zero-sum game. And that's exactly, Dr. Hodo, what you just said. Universality of human rights means that we all have them. Again, wherever we are, whatever we do, whatever we look like, wherever we're from. And that, I think, working toward that realization is a necessary part of whatever the success of this movement will be. And again, it's certainly focused upon the singular topic that we are now exploring tonight, but it applies across the board to everyone. So Dr. Hodo, I think observations are really prescient.
And with that, Mark, I will give you the last word. I want to, on behalf of Congressman Al Lawson and the Al Lawson for Congress campaign, thank Grace, JJ, Xavier, Dr. Hodo, as well as Mark for appearing on this panel. And I hope that we can continue this dialogue both on social media as well as potentially in fora similar to this in the future. With regards to time, we are coming close to the time, and I would like to yield to Congressman Lawson at this time to allow him to give some closing remarks this evening.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to thank Attorney Hobbs for moderating, doing an outstanding job. And I know Attorney Crump had to get off because it never stopped for him. I sometimes hate to be in his shoes. I see him in one city one day and another city another day because of all of the things that go on. And I want to thank you all, the panel. One of the things that I think Attorney Hobbs said is just not going to be the only time. This is the first step, similar to the first step approach that we passed in Congress in reference to the criminal justice system. We passed the first step to start the problem that we have with so many people being incarcerated for so minor crimes and so forth. And we learned a long time ago that we cannot bill our way out of the criminal justice system. So it has to change. And so we've been working on it ever since I've been. And this is the first time that we've been able to attract some bipartisan support so that we can start to move through the criminal justice system and make changes, which is so important to all our communities. You know, one great president said that people will little notice, not long remember what we say here, but they would never forget what we did here. And for you all serving here tonight, here's a step forward to make sure that we create a movement and not a moment. And this will not be the last time, because you see what is happening in America. My job that I'm hired to do by my constituents is go to Washington and make a difference in your lives and make sure that we accomplish some of the things that are so very important to you. So with the issue, does Black Lives Matter? Yes, Black lives really matter. And I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to remember that the most important issue comes up next Tuesday when it's time to vote in a primary. And I hope that all you all will tell your friends all over this district, from the Chattahoochee River to the St. Johns River in Jacksonville. I hope you tell your friends to cast your vote, to vote for the person that you think that will work hard for you in Washington, and to make sure that we take advantage of the, as Mark talked about, I think maybe Attorney Hobbs talked about, is the opportunity that is given to us, the opportunity to vote. For those, we are voting for those who are not able to vote, but we're going to make a way for them to vote. You know, and I tell people who are not able to vote, I say, you can make a difference by getting involved. And we're going to continue to work. And I know how much we have seen pass and how people try to keep people still from voting because they're afraid that they're not going to vote for them. So this has been great. And I turn it back over to you, Attorney Hobbs.
Thank you so much, Congressman Lawson. And I want to again thank each panelist. I want to thank you, Congressman Lawson. Definitely want to thank our brother, Benjamin Crump, for his participation this evening. And I want to make sure that I thank each of you that has paid attention this evening on Facebook. You know, often people ask, what can we do? What you can do is what we are doing, which is number one, educate yourself on all of the issues that are crucial in this era. Talk about the issues, talk about it on social media, talk about it at the dinner table, and make sure that your thoughts with regards to Black Lives Matter, as well as ending excessive uses of police force, are heard, so that your voices can then go into action in regards to voting. And yes, I am proud to say that I have already endorsed and continue to support Congressman Al Lawson, and hope to send him back to Washington, D.C. To continue to represent the citizens in the 5th Congressional District. We need proven leadership. We need people who have been out here fighting these fights long before many of us drew our first breaths. And Congressman Lawson, you are one of those individuals, and we stand behind you and continue to support you as you go into the primary next week, and then hopefully head on back to Washington, D.C. to continue to bring it home to North Florida. Thank you all this evening for participating. Thank you, sir. And we look forward to the next time we have an opportunity to convene and discuss the issues of critical importance. Have a good evening.